Why is it that Kenyan coffee farmers or Ethiopian coffee farmers or Ugandan or Tanzanian or whoever get 1 pence? It is easy to say, well, this is the long, sad history of Africa's integration into the global economy. But that will not be enough. Because the process that Richard is describing is a contemporary process, and its mechanisms, its motives, its power imbalances, and how those are being reworked is precisely the concrete agenda that we ought to respond to today. After all, as part of this process of the new international economic order, or the push towards new international economic order, as part of the process and the legacy of post-colonial liberation, we found a situation where some stabilization measures became part of the international trade regime as regards raw materials, commodities, and so on. So up until 1989, you did have an international coffee agreement. The coffee agreement was, as usual, as goes with powerful capitalist countries and their companies, it was implemented patchily. It was implemented with great parsimony and stinginess when it came to the obligations on the part of the global north. But nonetheless, it provided a floor, and just as importantly, it provided policy space for national governments to provide a floor for their small-scale producers, and to scale that up in terms of integrating into new productivity centers of productivity growth within their economies. But, so in 1989, what was the situation? 40% of the final price of a cup of coffee accrued to coffee-producing countries. We can talk about the domestic distribution about that, but the difference between 40% of a price of coffee that might be £3 or £4 and 1 pence, please, it's a long way, a long, steep regression that is taking place. So when we talk about trade imperialism today, it's not simply about reenacting a long-standing history of debilitating dependence on primary commodity production by regions in regions like Africa. We're talking also about the use of trade instruments, the use of trade institutions, the likes of which Richard has just described, to perniciously redesign, re-engineer, restructure, not simply the global commodity chains that are directly implicated in relation to things like commodities and so on and so forth, but to diversify on that basis elsewhere. And the implications of this are really profound. They are profound for a variety of reasons. One is that the agency of African people and those in the global south, the ability of institutions and governments to construct policy, the fact that, as one famous person who used to walk around Tottenham Court Road in the late 19th century said, the way in which the state and state policy must be resubsumed by society, into society, according to the popular needs of constituencies of the producers themselves. How that will be possible is not an easy thing to construct. It's not an easy thing by any means for 2 reasons. The first is the kind of way in which people are being set against each other. And the fragmentation of production in Africa is a direct reason why this is happening. So if you take a country like Nigeria, what would be the kind of big headline destabilization that we all hear about in Nigeria? Boko Haram. I'll tell you this. The conflict in the middle belt of Nigeria between farmers and herdsmen puts Boko Haram, it pales into insignificance in terms of deaths, in terms of social, community collapse, in terms of ethno-religious violence, and so on and so forth. So the idea of having an agenda about minimum wages, about a minimum basket of livelihood needs, about the redistribution of productive assets, of resources, of capabilities that can unite working people is central. And that is why this process that we're describing is central. If it is central in Nigeria, it is central internationally as well. Because whether or not there is migration, and there will be under the conditions that I'm describing, whether or not there is migration, there will be the fact that we're all thrown in together into global markets where in parts of the world it relies on super exploitation, on the fact that there has been no technology transfer, on the fact that remaining competitive in export markets cannot rely on productivity gains through technological capacity development, but rather on pressing poor people down in terms of their wages, in terms of their conditions, in terms of farmers' incomes, and so on and so forth. As long as that remains the case, then we are undercutting each other from wherever we're located. And that's a central point about the need to develop an agenda that, yes, is right and has a depth and purchase within the British working class communities and among all progressive sections. But it's important that we scale that up, that there's a coherence between that, a firm linkage between that and what we do internationally. Otherwise, the difficulty of having the kind of transition and transformation that we want to see is impossible to achieve. We had Dilma Rousseff yesterday talk in terms of the way in which the PT government in Brazil managed to retain certain key mechanisms and vehicles in terms of the state's, if you like, its economic infrastructure, state companies, state banks, so on and so forth. But the fact remains, as we know, that neither Brazil nor Venezuela fundamentally transformed the regime of accumulation in their countries. For which reason, when the commodity price goes down or global economic conditions go bad, even the minimum social redistribution that you could do with gains from a greater export earnings goes away. And the kind of instability that we have seen, the rollback of the pink tide that we have seen, comes to life. Now, if that is the case with Brazil, the 7th or 6th or 8th biggest economy in the world, what does that mean for Burundi? And that is a reality that we have to confront. And in the case of Burundi, it doesn't mean also that new forms of development, new forms of growth are not occurring, except that they are occurring under the aegis, one of a structural dependence on neoliberal markets, but even more tellingly on global finance, on foreign investment, and so on. So new areas are developing. A case in point, VW and parts of the European auto industry, which finds that partly as a result of Brexit, it has to kind of find new areas of relocating. VW in the last year has opened 3 turnkey plants, and turnkey investment in Africa is rare. It's usually mergers and acquisitions and so on and so forth. But turnkey plants in countries like Rwanda, in Ghana, and in Tanzania, or so somewhere else where the idea is that these will be platforms for penetrating the regional market. So when you have even initiatives such as the Africa's own, supposedly its own autonomous free trade agreement to construct a regional market, to be able to kind of offer a scaling up of economic integration, to be able to go back to a kind of meaningful industrial policy, you find that already embedded within this is actually the presence or the monopoly presence of these transnational companies. And this is not a small matter, even in terms of the global, the global economy. We know, for example, that clearly part of the problems of Brexit is the disruption of global production and supply chains. So this is a central issue for everyone. But when you have a situation where in Africa, and again, this is reported by the Financial Times, that what you call B2B, business-to-business transactions, as a sector of economic growth, okay, that the most wide open space for that, for transnational companies today, is Africa, the poorest part of the world. In the same way as for the fintech industry, the new frontier is 30% of all global investments on fintech target the poorest households in Africa. Yeah, sure, they will scale back to you and back to student loans, and we know that will happen. But for now, this is the kind of foothold that they're seeking to gain. What the Financial Times describes in terms of the B2B, the business-to-business landscape, is instructive. It says that the biggest market in the world is that of China, 8 billion or so. The next biggest market is that of India, 2.9 billion or so. But both these markets have 2 features, which does not apply to the case of Africa. 1, they are plateauing. 2, they still involve, certainly in the case of, even more in the case of China than in India, they involve local producers, local production networks as part of this process. In Africa, there's no African player in the B2B market, which is 2.7 billion, rapidly catching up with India, and it will be the only source of global B2B business growth between now and 2050. So I am suggesting that if you add this to some of the problems that we face in terms of the manifestation of global crises such as the climate crisis, we saw that in Darfur, we see that in Nigeria as I described, we saw that last year in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where within 1 year, 2018, there was a level of deforestation equal to 1.5 times the size of Belgium in 1 year. And this process is escalating. In terms of the rate of increase of deforestation, there's a weighting. The study which does a weighting between deforestation, pollution by plastics, and pollution by pesticides. The first 3 countries in the world in terms of rates, despite Bolsonaro, despite everybody else, the rate of escalation, Ghana number 1, Ivory Coast number 2, Cameroon number 3. So again, we have to see that the future of humanity, you cannot make a claim, any kind of meaningful claim, about rebuilding a world for the many, where the African question is not at its heart. And even if you want to be crude about it, and even if you want to be good about it, the sheer facts of population tell you so. When it comes to discussing Africa and population, again, there's enormous confusion. So even someone who I have the most enormous respect for, the most esteemed David Attenborough, and all the wonderful work that he's doing on climate change, is still able to say that famines occur in Ethiopia and now 2 million people facing famine in Somalia because of overpopulation. Now, yes, Africa might have the fastest rate of population growth anywhere in the world. But let's qualify this claim a little bit more.
We're the youngest.
That too. Thank you. Unfortunately, it doesn't include me, but you know. You can't win them all, I suppose. But if we qualify that thing about population growth a bit further, first of all, the population density of Africa remains extremely low. So there is no part of Europe which does not have a higher population density than the most densest part of population in Africa. So really, it's not about a population question. It's about the capacity of that population to have the productive means to satisfy their livelihood and to exercise the demand that will enable them to do so on a viable basis. That's the first thing. Second thing is that even if we look at it from the point of view of a crisis of global demand or a crisis of global overconsumption, whichever way, and these contradictions coexist with one another, the consumption levels of African populations is by far the lowest in the world. And the average US citizen, for example, in terms of consumption, is 450 times that of an average African. If you want to start population control, I think you better start. Note that